understanding of social reform. And then Ambedkar goes on to describe what actually is going on, what he means by social reform. Under the rule of the Peshwas in the Maratha country, the untouchable was not allowed to use the public streets if a Hindu was coming along, lest he should pollute the Hindu by his shadow. The untouchable was required to have a black thread either on his wrist or around his neck as a sign or a mark to prevent the Hindus from getting themselves polluted by mistake. In Pune, the capital of the Peshwa, the untouchable was required to carry, strung from his waist, a broom to sweep away from behind himself the dust he trod on, lest a Hindu walking on the same dust should be polluted. In Pune, the untouchable was required to carry an earthen pot hung around his neck wherever he went, for holding his spit, lest his spit falling on the earth should pollute a Hindu who might unknowingly happen to tread on it. Then he goes on to talk about what is happening with untouchables at that time. And here the annotations will really help you to put this whole thing in context. And in the introduction, I've written about many incidents that are happening today, which could as well have been happening in 1892 or in 1912 or today, Then Ambedkar says, having stated the facts, let me now state the case for social reform. In doing so, I will follow Mr. Banerjee as nearly as I can and ask the political-minded Hindus, are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow a large class of your own countrymen, like the untouchables, to use public schools? Are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow them to use the use of public wells? Are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow them the use of public streets? Are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow them to wear what apparel or ornaments they like? Are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow them to eat the food they like? I can ask a string of such questions, but these will suffice. And then he goes on in this incredibly erudite speech of his. But I just could actually stand here and talk to you for hours about this, which I won't do. But instead, before we start this conversation, I'm going to read an essay that Gandhi wrote the same year that Ambedkar wrote The Annihilation of Caste. The introduction actually gives a long history of the lead up to how this speech came to be written, what was the political context, what is the history of the anti-caste movement, how it was, for example, that at the turn of the century, when the idea of empire, when a person could ride into Delhi and take the throne, turned into the empire, the idea of the nation state, the idea of representation, how suddenly, for years and years before that, untouchables had been converting to Christianity, to Islam, to Sikhism. Nobody seemed to mind. There's a wonderful excerpt from something Jyotiba Phule, who was one of Ambedkar's intellectual predecessors, says about, obviously today the contestation about the Hindu rights writing of the history of Islam is about how they desecrated temples and how they murdered and pillaged and so on. And what we call the Hindu left replies with a more moderate account of that. But what Jyotiba Phule says as an untouchable, he says, yes, they desecrated temples, but thank God they did it. Thank God they did it. They desecrated temples, they invited us to eat with them, they made us equals. Of course, as we know, that isn't strictly speaking true, because today Islam, Sikhism, and Christianity all practice caste, but at least not theologically and theoretically, but certainly in practice. But I want to so Gandhi was a believer earlier in all the minutiae of the caste system, and later on he turned to saying, okay, I believe in the Varna system, which Ambedkar called the parent of the caste system, but he very firmly believed in the idea of ancestral occupations. So when Ambedkar wrote The Annihilation of Caste, Gandhi, who was by then 68 years old, wrote a classic essay called The Ideal Bhangi. And this is what it says. The Brahmin's duty is to look after the sanitation of the soul. The Bhangi is that of the body of society. And yet, our woebegone Indian society has branded the Bhangi as a social pariah, set him down at the bottom of the scale, held him fit only to receive kicks and abuse, a creature who must subsist on the leavings of the caste people and dwell on the dung heap. If only we had given due recognition to the status of the Bhangi as equal to that of the Brahmin, our village, no less their inhabitants, would have looked the picture of cleanliness and order. I therefore make bold to state, without any manner of hesitation or doubt, that not till the invidious distinction between Brahmin and Bhangi is removed will our society enjoy health, prosperity, and peace, and be happy. He then outlined the educational requirements, practical skills, and etiquette an ideal Bhangi should possess. What quality, I'm quoting, what qualities therefore should such an honored servant of society exemplify in his person? In my opinion, an ideal Bhangi should have a thorough knowledge of the principles of sanitation. He should know how a right kind of latrine is constructed and the correct way of cleaning it. He should know how to overcome and destroy the odor of excreta and the various disinfectants to render them innocuous. He should likewise know the process of converting urine and night soil into manure. But that is not all. My ideal Bhangi would know the quality of night soil and urine and would keep a close watch on these and give timely warning to the individual concerned. Unquote. The Manusmriti says a Shudra should not amass wealth even if he has the ability, for a Shudra who amasses wealth annoys the Brahmin. Gandhi, a Banya for whom the Manusmriti prescribes usury as a divine calling, says, such an ideal Bhangi, while deriving his livelihood from his occupation, would approach it only as a sacred duty. In other words, he would not dream of amassing wealth out of it. Now, 70 years later, in his book, Karma Yogi, which he withdrew after the Valmiki community protested, Narendra Modi proved he was a diligent disciple of the Mahatma. And he says, I do not believe they have been doing this job just to sustain their livelihood. Had this been so, they would not have continued with this kind of job generation after generation. At some point of time, somebody must have got the enlightenment that it is their, Valmiki's, duty to work for the happiness of the entire society and the gods, that they have to do this job bestowed upon them by gods, and this job should continue as internal spiritual activity for centuries. The Naram Dal and the Garam Dal may be separate political parties today, but ideologically they're not as far apart from each other as we think they are. Now, there is a lot to talk about. I mentioned, for example, the Mahad Satyagraha. In 1927, there was something called the Bole Resolution that allowed untouchables and everybody access to public water tanks and so on. I'm just going to read briefly about the Mahad Satyagraha, which preceded the Salt Satyagraha, and I think you could see the influences. In 1923, the Legislative Council of Bombay, whose elections had been boycotted by the Congress, passed a resolution, the Bole Resolution, that allowed untouchables to use public tanks, wells, schools, courts, and dispensaries. In the town of Mahad, the municipality declared that it had no objection if untouchables used the Chavadar tank in the town. Passing a resolution was one thing, acting on it quite another. After 4 years of mobilization, the untouchables gathered courage and in March 1927 held a 2-day conference in Mahad. Money for the conference was raised by public contribution. In an unpublished manuscript, the scholar Anand Teltumre quotes Anand Vinayak Chitre, one of the organizers of the Mahad Satyagraha, saying that 40 villages contributed rupees 3 each, and a play about Tukaram was staged in Bombay, and that made 23 rupees, making the total collection of rupees 143. Contrast this with Gandhi's troubles. Just a few months before the Mahad Satyagraha, on 10th January 1927, Gandhi wrote to his industrialist patron, G.D. Birla, and I'm quoting, "My thirst for money is simply unquenchable. I need at least rupees 2 lakhs for khadi, untouchability, and education. The dairy work makes another 50,000. Then there's the ashram expenditure. No work remains unfinished for want of funds, but God gives after severe trials. This also satisfies me. You can give as you like for whatever work you have faith in." The Mahad conference was attended by about 3,000 untouchables. And by the way, I use this word untouchables as Ambedkar uses it, because he uses it with this cold anger. Anyway, I've explained that in my text, so I'm not using it loosely. The Mahad conference was attended by about 3,000 untouchables and a handful of progressive members of the privileged castes. Veer Savarkar, out of jail by now, was one of the supporters of the Mahad Satyagraha. Ambedkar presided over the meeting. On the morning of the second day, I'm sorry to interrupt myself, but one of the things I think I didn't complete saying was that when this whole anxiety over representation happened, it led to an anxiety of demography. And suddenly, this conversion of the untouchables to Islam and Hinduism became a problem. And that's when this whole host of reform movements sprang up, trying to keep the Dalits in the Hindu fold, keep them in the servants' quarters, but keep them in the Hindu fold. And in fact, the Garam Dal, led by Tilak and with the Hindu Mahasabha and people like Veer Savarkar, were very much part of the proselytization of keeping, of sort of the Shuddhi program, for example, run by the Arya Samaj, to keep purified Dalits and bring them into the Hindu fold. And the Congress was doing the same under Gandhi in a different way. So that is why, the presence of, say, someone like Savarkar at the Mahad Satyagraha is interesting, but it's explained in this way. Ambedkar presided over the meeting. On the morning of the second day, people decided to march to the Chavadar tank and drink water. The privileged caste watched in horror as a procession of untouchables walked through the town four abreast and drank water from the tank. After the shock subsided, came the violent counter-attack with clubs and sticks. 20 untouchables were injured. Ambedkar urged his people to stay firm and not to strike back. A rumor was deliberately spread that the untouchables planned to enter the Vireshwar temple, which added a hysterical edge to the violence. The untouchables scattered. Some found shelter in Muslim homes. For his own safety, Ambedkar spent the night in a police station. Once calm returned, the Brahmins purified the tank with prayers and with 108 pots of cow dung, cow urine, milk, curd, and ghee. The symbolic exercise of their rites did not satisfy the Mahad Satyagrahis. In June 1927, an advertisement appeared in Bahishkrit Bharat, Excluded India, a fortnightly that Ambedkar had founded, asking members of the depressed classes who wished to take the agitation further to enlist themselves. And then, basically, there's a second Mahad Satyagraha, where once again they gather, 10,000 people attended this time, and Ambedkar publicly burns the Manusmriti. And then he gives us this extremely stirring speech, which you really should read. I'll just read a little bit of it to you because it's a long one.